21 NATO drones should have flown into Russia as a response to give exactly the sort of signal that we will do the same what you do to us, and if you want to go for it, here you get it. But I find it worrisome that the EU and NATO have not responded in that way, because it now suggests to Moscow that it can go further, that it can try new things, and that it will become more provocative, more escalatory, and the stakes will increase. And I just hope that the people in the national capitals and in Brussels will understand that there's a different reaction necessary to these Russian provocations.
Hi everyone, welcome to 24 War and Politics. Today my guest is Andreas Umland, analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies in the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. We are going to discuss Orban's open letter to Zelenskyy and how Hungary blocks 20th package of sanctions against Russia. Also, we are going to talk about peace talks in Geneva, current political and military position of Putin, and potential Russian aggression against NATO. Andreas, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. And I have an additional position, which is as a policy fellow at the newly founded European Policy Institute in Kiev, EPIC.
Okay. Let's start. The US Secretary of State was asked whether there might be a moment when the Donald Trump administration would change its tactics and increase pressure on Russia. Rubio responded, "The administration continues to sell weaponry to Ukraine. We don't sell weapons to Russia, and we don't sanction Ukraine." According to this quote, we Ukrainians should be thankful that US are not imposing sanctions against us. I would like you to comment this statement of Rubio.
Well, I think it's in contradiction to a number of documents that the US has signed. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which obliged the US to respect the borders and sovereignty of Ukraine. There's a strategic partnership between the US and Ukraine still functioning, I guess, since 2009. And there are other obligations, one would think, between these two countries that make these sort of comments that the US would not sanction Ukraine in this war look strange, to my opinion. This is a break of 30 years of Ukrainian-US relationships, and that now the US is selling weapons to European countries that then give these weapons to Ukraine is simply a good business for the US and is to the advantage of the US and cannot be simply regarded as help, because US companies are profiting from this sale of weapons.
I would like to talk to you about Orban's open letter to Zelenskyy. Hungarian Prime Minister openly accused Ukrainian president of anti-Hungarian position and called immediately reopen Druzhba pipeline. What does it indicate in terms of domestic and geopolitics?
Well, first of all, I'm a little bit confused here how far indeed Ukraine has closed this pipeline, or we had actually these sort of pipeline discussions already long before the start of the war in 2014, and how far indeed Ukraine is responsible for the non-arrival of Russian oil in Hungary. And the other point here is, of course, that this Hungarian import of Russian oil means that Hungary is paying for this oil to Russia, and that thereby Hungary is indirectly supporting Russia's war, because that is obviously something that is good for the Russian budget, the Russian economy, and for Russian warfare. And to talk here about friendship between Hungary and Ukraine is somewhat strange, because if the Hungarians were really friends, they would not support the Russian war in this in this way. There are other ways to import oil from other countries. That would be an expression of friendship, but not an economic cooperation with Russia during this war of expansion and war of annihilation, genocidal war that Russia is conducting against Ukraine.
In your opinion, why does Viktor Orban behave like this? It is only because of election campaign or something more?
I think it is linked to the election campaign because the domestic record of Orban has been modest. Hungary is one of the poorest countries of the European Union. It has developed far less impressive than, let's say, Poland. Hungary and Poland were once, 30 years ago, the forerunners in terms of European integration. And now there is a gap between Poland and Hungary, where Poland has moved far ahead of Hungary in its economic and social development. And the other point here is that there is a lot of allegations about misuse of EU funding by the current government, and a sort of dislocation of this EU funding for private projects. And therefore, the Hungarian government is now trying to make Ukraine a domestic issue for Hungary, which is sort of the most important issue allegedly the most important issue for Hungarians. And the attitude towards Ukraine should then presumably determine the choice when the elections happen in April this year. So that is a tactic of Orban, and I just hope that Hungarians will see this as a diversion, as an attempt to simply divert the attention of Hungarians from the domestic issues, the domestic problems that Hungary has, and that people will not indeed see Ukraine as being responsible for the current economic and social problems in Hungary.
I would like to get back to the beginning of our interview and ask you the same question, but about Rubio. Why does Rubio behave like this when it comes to my first question about imposing sanctions, about not imposing sanctions against Ukraine?
Well, my suspicion, and I haven't been to the US for many years, and I don't really feel that competent now to comment what is happening in Washington, but my suspicion is that this is simply the directive from the White House, from Trump, from people around Trump, who have taken now this approach that they want to end the Russian-Ukrainian war through pressure on Kiev, and not pressure on Russia, or insufficient pressure on Russia, and that they think the war can be ended in a sustainable way by making Ukraine give away parts of its sovereignty and parts of its territory. Although I think the effect would be exactly the opposite, that such a diplomatic victory for Russia would simply increase the appetite in Moscow for conquering Odessa and Kharkiv and Mykolaiv and so on. We know that these appetites exist in Moscow, and if there's any success of this diplomatic strategy, then the demands will just increase.
I got you. Thank you. The European Union risks failing to pass its 20th package of sanctions against Russia, as Viktor Orban and his government threaten to veto the sanctions and withhold 90 billion euros in aid to Ukraine until Russian oil transit through the Druzhba pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia resumes. Situation like this weakens joint European front against Russia. Do you assume that Putin can be successful in European fragmentation in future, and how Brussels may protect itself?
Unfortunately, Putin has been already to a certain degree successful in this attempt to fragment the European Union, which is, I think, connected simply to the fact that the European Union was not made for this sort of conflict. And this whole European project was built on the assumption that the countries that would enter the European Union would then also adhere to the basic values of the European Union, and that there's a sort of collective European transnational agreement about certain fundamental domestic and foreign political issues. And with Hungary, and now partly also with Slovakia, and partly even with the Czech Republic, we now have a situation that countries are leaving this consensus within the European Union and are using their veto power within the European Union to boycott it. And in the most egregious way, Hungary is doing that. Although one would think that Hungary's experience with both Tsarist imperialism and Soviet imperialism would make it one of the staunchest allies of Ukraine rather than one of its enemies, as it is today.
Steve Witkoff said that he believes in bilateral meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin. I would like to ask you, under what circumstances do you think such meeting can occur, if it does, in general?
I think it can occur in a third country, a neutral country, I don't know, in an Arab country or whatever other country, or Switzerland or something like that. Perhaps that can happen, but I don't think it will have much of a result at the current moment. For that, the pressure on Russia would first have to rise, and then Putin may start engaging in serious negotiations if there is a more profound wish in Moscow for peace. I think there's now already a large faction in the Moscow political and economic elite that wants peace, because Russia is getting into a more and more complicated economic and social situation. But so far, I think this pressure is insufficient, and therefore such a summit, Ukrainian-Russian summit, would not bring much of a result.
You have mentioned Switzerland. We know that American delegation meets with Ukrainian one and with Kirill Dmitriev in Geneva. How do you understand development of peace talks? And do you actually you have answered this question that you don't believe in any outcome, efficient outcome, but how do you understand and how do you see development of these peace talks?
I think these are not real peace talks. This is a negotiation theater so far. Maybe the most easy way to understand is that the glaring absence of the European Union or of Europe in general in these talks is an illustration of why this is merely a theater. Russia is interested in this theater because it wants to influence Trump, who is easily manipulated, and Russia is presenting itself as allegedly ready for a compromise. Ukraine, on the other hand, has no other choice than also participate in this theater and on its side make clear that it is ready for a ceasefire and that it has already made concessions, and that peace is achievable from the Ukrainian side. And so both countries are trying to persuade Trump that the other side is the problem. I don't want to make them equal here, but this is the obvious reasons that these negotiations are happening at all. From my point of view, they don't make sense if the EU is not represented in these talks. And by the way, there was in April 2014. There were also Geneva talks, and this was exactly the format that is needed. Russia, Ukraine, the US, and the EU, and there was then a declaration of these four actors, the Geneva Declaration of April 2014. Once this is restored, my hope for a successful outcome of these peace talks would increase.
And actually, let's face it, when it comes to this political theater, this theater only for one spectator, only for one visitor, for Donald Trump. Do you agree?
Yes, it's mainly about Trump. It's also for other audiences. Putin may also engage in these peace talks for his domestic audiences, for audiences in the so-called global south. Ukraine is also participating in these allegedly, peace-serving talks for the, so to say, West European audience that is demanding from their governments to engage in talks with Russia. And now we have these talks without European participation, but still we have now a whole year of this shuttle diplomacy and of these talks. And the result of it during this year is that the number of civilian victims of the war has rapidly increased during 2025 compared to 2024. So the peace talks bring more death and more war to Ukraine. That is the actual result of these so-called peace talks.
2 days ago, we had the anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and we see that Russia hasn't managed to achieve its main war goals during these 4 years of the full-scale invasion. And a lot of experts say that Putin is trapped and he is a prisoner of this war. First of all, do you agree with this statement? And how do you understand current Putin's position?
Yes, I think Putin cannot easily leave this war because it would now look as if Russia would be making concessions and Russia wouldn't have achieved its aims in this war. And that would be a domestic political problem for Putin, because there are many hawks in the Russian political elite which are expecting some sort of triumph of Russia in this war. And Putin himself, of course, wants a victory. The problem now being, however, that the front line is relatively stable. Recently, Ukraine has made small advances. Earlier, Russia has been making advances, and that the economic and social situation of Russia is becoming more and more precarious. But he cannot easily get out of it. He needs to present some sort of victory to his domestic audience. Then perhaps he could leave. I think there would have been a chance in Anchorage when there was this meeting with Trump that Putin could have then agreed to some sort of economic deal with the US, and then could have agreed to Zelensky's proposal to make the current front line the contact line for a ceasefire. But he didn't take that chance, and now he is indeed trapped.
Actually, I would like to talk to you more about Putin's logic in terms of the war. I mean, what is he counting on when it comes to Ukraine's defeat? How is he going to win in his perception?
I'm not sure there is such in Putin's mind or in general in Moscow such a concrete formulation of what has to be achieved. I mean, there is this plan Maximum that was presented in December 2021 by Russia to the West to basically totally revise the political or geopolitical order in Eastern and Central Europe, where basically there was a demand to return to the situation of 1997 in the division of Europe. But that is perhaps not any longer sort of the thing that would be needed. But what Putin certainly wants is some sort of sign that he has had a success in these negotiations. Now the topic is here the western regions of the Donetsk Oblast that should be given away by Ukraine simply as a prize for peace, or something else that he can domestically present. But I'm not even sure that this would be then indeed the end of the war. I think it may be only seen by Putin and his entourage as simply one step forward towards fully defeating Ukraine.
Yeah, and actually, it proves and it indicates once again that he is a prisoner of this war. He's trapped into it. Okay, let's take into consideration situation on the ground, on the front line, geopolitical factor, economic possibilities of Russia and Ukraine, both of them military power and human resources, and compare all of this. What possible scenarios of Ukraine-Russia war for upcoming year do you forecast if we compare all I mentioned before?
For wars, I think forecasts are notoriously difficult and then are often falsified by the real development. Remember 2022, most of the forecasts were a quick victory for Russia. And perhaps Russia was indeed close to a victory if the events in Hostomel would have developed slightly different. Yes, so the most likely, perhaps, scenario is now that the war of attrition that is currently going on will continue, and that within a year we may still be in the same situation, basically, as today. Both countries will continue to adapt, but there could be also some radical developments in the Russian economy on the front line, and one cannot exclude new, unexpected developments as let's say, the Prigozhin mutiny of 2023. So I'm hopeful that actually we will come earlier to an end if Moscow indeed becomes scared of continuing the war and perhaps losing not only the war against Ukraine, but also losing regime stability and perhaps even the integrity of the Russian state.
Yeah, actually, you have mentioned Prigozhin and possible radical developments, and my next question is linked to it. Do you believe in any black swan event when it comes to Putin's fate and the end of Russia-Ukraine war? Something like the second Prigozhin's march or palace coup? I would like you to expand your thought about it.
Well, philosophically, I believe in that the Russian Empire will end at a certain point, like other empires have ended, and they looked when they existed as being eternal, and that they will never end, and the same, and that went, by the way, for the Tsarist Empire in the early 20th century, or for the Soviet Union in the mid 20th century. These two states looked stable and forever when they existed, and then they collapsed. And I think the Russian Empire, and perhaps the Russian Federation even, will collapse at some point. But when exactly that happens, I don't know. And of course, the nature of black swans is that we don't even know the black swans. We didn't know the black swans because before they appeared, that is the idea of a black swan, that you can't know about it in advance. It's only once it's there, then you know about it. And so one could speculate that perhaps there are various points of instability within the Russian political and socioeconomic system that could suddenly then create tension, or perhaps even an escalation within Russia. But when and how that happens, I cannot foresee. But I believe it will happen at some point.
I gotcha. Several months ago, we were observing the situation when Russian drones and fighter jets violate NATO airspace. It was a kind of intimidation and checking how organization would respond. I think that Putin got clear signal about NATO's indecision. How would Russia provoke and distract NATO further in future? We see attempts to blur NATO's unity, political interference, and other tools of hybrid war. But we know that everything is supposed to develop. So how could events develop in this context?
Yes, Russia will continue to basically try to distract the EU and NATO from supporting Ukraine. It will try to increase the stakes. It will try to make European countries feel insecure and thereby to divert maybe resources that could be given to Ukraine for national defense, for the defense of the European countries. That seems to stand behind it. And there will a lot depend on how much the EU, NATO, the member countries of the two organizations will see through this and will adequately respond to these provocations by Russia. I think actually at the current situation, the West could very resolutely and very forcefully and very forward-leaning respond to such provocations, because Russia will now, in my estimate, not start a second war against the EU and NATO, and Russia cannot conduct a two fronts, two wars. And therefore, I think what should have happened is when these 21, I think, drones that flew into Poland last year, what should have happened is that 21 NATO drones should have flown into Russia as a response to give exactly the sort of signal that we will do the same what you do to us, and if you want to go for it, here you get it. But I find it worrisome that the EU and NATO have not responded in that way, because it now suggests to Moscow that it can go further, that it can try new things, and that it will become more provocative, more escalatory, and the stakes will increase. And I just hope that the people in the national capitals and in Brussels will understand that there's a different reaction necessary to these Russian provocations.
Andreas, thank you very much for your expertise and for your time, and goodbye.